Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed your lunch. In this presentation, we're going to go over evidence-based funding and English learners. We hope this will be an informative session that allows you to walk away with a basic understanding of how English learners receive funding through the state funding formula. And we'll also talk about reporting and planning requirements. The clicker is not working. Oh, okay. Thank you. So I'm Edwin Sanchez Molina. I'm a principal consultant at the multilingual department. And my colleague, Luke Corey here, he's the senior resource policy specialist in the finance department at ISB. Still not working. No, no worries. Oh, okay. I think so. All right, cool. All right, so, sorry.
All right, so let's get started with a couple of poll questions. We want to get a feel for what you know about state funding as it relates to English learners. And this is definitely not a pre-assessment, so don't think of it as one. For each of the statements here, we'd like you to answer with a true or false. To access this poll, you just scan that QR code with your phone, and you should see something pop up where you see each of those questions. So the first question is, if my neighbor were to ask me how English learners are funded through EBF, I would know exactly what to say, true or false. Second, do I know the statutory requirements related to spending EBF dollars that are attributable to EL students? Of course I do. Third, I can find the exact dollar amount my district receives in EBF funding for EL students in less than 5 minutes. 4, not only do I know what FRIS stands for, I can find expenditure reports for my district, no sweat. And finally, I have participated in completing the EBF spending plan with my district. Take a few minutes to answer those questions in Menti. And we will show the results here in a second. Are you accessing this? Oh, okay, that's right, yeah. Okay, this is kind of the ratio we were expecting to see. We'll let it populate a little bit longer. So a lack of clarity a little bit about how districts do receive funds for EL students through the state funding formula. Not quite clear about the statutory requirements for planning for and spending those dollars. Not certain where to locate the amount your district receives each year for those students, or how to find the expenditure reports for spending those dollars. And then only about a third of folks in the room so far have participated in completing the spending plan. We will hope to see a little bit of movement on those questions by the end here.
Okay, so here's our agenda for today, what we plan to cover. So we'll be looking at what evidence-based funding is attributable to English learners and how is it calculated. Where can I identify the actual amount of funding my district receives for English learners? What are the statutory requirements for spending and reporting the use of EBF that's attributable to English learners? And how can the redesigned EBF spending plan support districts in a collaboratively deciding on how to spend their evidence-based funding attributable to English learners? And we'll have some time at the end for some questions and answers as well. All right, thank you. So right now we'll go over the first bullet point on what evidence-based funding is attributable to English learners and how is it calculated. So when EBF was signed into law in August 2017, it consolidated and replaced 5 grants. So the general state aid, EL state funding, and 3 separate special ed grants. The dollars from those 5 grants were then combined into one streamlined source, which we call the base funding minimum. This was an assurance that with the first implementation of EBF in fiscal year 2018, districts would at least receive this much money for EBF. To keep it concise, the important thing to remember is that the original 5 funding sources never went away. They have just been reallocated into one fund. In addition to the base funding minimum, districts also have an additional funding stream called the tiered funding. We'll get into that next. What we hope to address in this section is what funding in EBF is attributable to EL students.
So one of the key components of EBF is that the amount that districts are allocated accumulates each year, provided sufficient appropriations. When EBF was first introduced in FY 2018, the base funding minimum directly included allocated dollars from the FY 2017 EL education grant. For FY 18, that base funding minimum amount was then built upon with tier funding, which included dollar amounts for other populations of students, but also included amounts that were attributable to ELs. The base funding minimum in FY 19 was then the total amount that was allocated to districts in FY 18, both the base funding minimum and the tiered funding. This process is repeated each year. Tier funding was allocated in the first 3 fiscal years with EBF and was not allocated in FY 21. However, districts received tier funding in FY 22 and again this year in FY 23. Each year, the amount that is attributable to EL students grows through this additional tier funding. So what do we mean by tier funding that is attributable to EL students? To understand that, we need to start with the EBF formula. Put simply, EBF compares what a district has for educating its students, its local resources, to what a district needs to educate its students. We refer to what a district has as its resources. We refer to what a district needs as the adequacy target. The adequacy target is what Illinois believes is the cost of providing an adequate education to students in the district. Built into the formula is the understanding that the cost of providing an adequate education can vary. Additional resources are required to support low-income students, special education students, and English learners. Now, if we divide a district's local resources by its adequacy target, the result is known as the percentage of adequacy. This percentage gives us an idea of where districts are at in terms of their need and their ability to provide an adequate education to their students with their resources. A district with 70% adequacy has 70% of the resources needed to provide an adequate education per the state's funding formula. A district with 150% percentage of adequacy has an excess of resources when compared to the adequacy target. And districts are assigned tiers based on this percentage of adequacy. New resources are directed primarily based on those tiers. The vast majority of new funding goes to Tier 1 and Tier 2 districts, which are the furthest from adequacy. You can see how tier funding is directed here. Combined, Tier 1 and 2 receive 99% of any new resources appropriated by the General Assembly. And the result of this is that Tier 1 and 2 districts have increased in adequacy over time, which you can see in the second table. The formula's intent is to funnel new resources where they are most needed, and here's evidence that that's working over time. When we say the cost to provide an adequate education can vary, here's how the formula approaches that. In addition to cost factors assigned to all students, the ratios on this slide are used to calculate the cost of an education for English learners. You can see that for every 125 ELs, the cost to cover one intervention teacher is built into the adequacy target. For every 100 EL students, the cost to cover one EL core teacher is built into the adequacy target. These costs are based on the average teacher salary for the district. This information informs the calculation we saw on the previous slide that determines the district's percentage of adequacy, what they have divided by what they need. This information does not dictate how districts spend their funds, but simply informs a district's overall need in terms of adequately serving these student populations. I want to really stamp 2 points here. The cost factors for ELs are based on positions and average salary to fill the role. They are not based on costs for curriculum or supplies. Second, cost factors are not funding. Districts do not receive the full amount of the cost factors, nor are they required to invest these dollars specifically in these cost factors. But what they do receive is based on the cost of ensuring proper staffing to provide the additional supports that these students require. When thinking about the actual dollar amounts that are provided to ELs, they are, again, the original base funding minimum, which included the FY17 EL education grant, and the tier funding, which is attributable to each student as a result of the calculation of cost factors for ELs. So let's break that out further. We just learned that the cost factors are based on specific positions that serve these students. Those positions are multiplied by the cost of teacher salaries, benefits, and substitute teachers. The result gives us the EL cost in terms of a district's adequacy target. Again, this is the cost of what a district would need to adequately serve this population of students according to the state funding formula. That number divided by the district's overall adequacy target gives us the share of the adequacy target that is attributable to English learners. That percentage is multiplied by the amount of tier funding to get the dollar amount of new tier funding each year that is specifically attributable to those students. In other words, if your district receives tier funding, and if it has EL students, we calculate the amount of tier funding that is attributable to those students in your district. For example, if this calculation shows us that 5% of a district's adequacy target is attributable to ELs, and if the district has $200,000 in tier funding, then 5% of the tier funding, or $10,000, is for those students and should be expended as such. These amounts are in addition to and not in lieu of other funding. By the way, don't worry about memorizing these formulas. In a few minutes, we will show you where you can access a report to see the actual dollar amounts for your district.
So EO enrollment is calculated twice a year on October 1st and March 31st. And the average is taken of those numbers. ISB then uses the greater of either a 3-year average enrollment or the most recent year of enrollment to inform the student ratios that were shown on the previous slide. Taking the 3-year average benefits districts that have a declining number of ELs, whereas taking the most recent year of enrollment benefits districts with an increasing EL population. So on this slide, you'll see an example of how the ratios are calculated. At the top is a table with EO enrollment for a district. You'll see that the most recent EO enrollment is greater than the 3-year average. So that is the number that's used to calculate the student support ratios. Had the 3-year average been greater than the most recent year, the 3-year average enrollment would have been used to calculate the cost factors. For each of the EL cost factors in the formula, the ratio is applied to the enrollment to determine the total FTE embedded in the adequacy target for the district. Regional salaries and benefits are used to calculate the actual dollar amount. Again, this is not funding. The purpose of this is to estimate the cost for providing an adequate education. Local resources are then used to compare to what the adequacy target is to determine a percentage of adequacy. That percentage is what drives new tier funding. The formula is designed to send the vast majority of new resources to districts that are furthest from the adequacy. Okay, so we've covered the basics of how EL students receive EBF dollars. Let's now discuss how and where you can locate the actual amount of funding your district receives for English learners. Okay, so first you'll go to isb.net. You'll scroll down. You'll see that box, learning conditions, with the teacher and the students. You'll click on the first bullet point, finance, budgets, and funding. Then you'll scroll down to the bottom left, evidence-based funding. You'll click on the first bullet point. There's also a link at the bottom if you just want to enter that too. And then once you're on that page, you'll scroll down. I know it's a lot of clicking and scrolling. You'll click on the third blue bar there, that drop down. You'll click on reports. You'll see that fourth bullet point there. It's titled Fiscal Year 2023 English Learner Education Funding Allocation Calculation Data, and automatically populate or download a Excel spreadsheet.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's in the spreadsheet, and these exist for every year for which there is new tier funding. So you won't find it for 2021, but you'll see it for 2022 and 2023. So we're using the most recent file here. And I realize this screenshot is a little hard to see, but what you do see are columns of data for each district that receives state funding attributable to English learners. And there are really three key figures to look at here. In column 9, you'll find the English learner investments in the adequacy target. Remember, again, this is not funding. These are the dollars within the adequacy target that are attributable to English learners in the district. In column 16, you'll see the tier funding for that district that is attributable to English learners. So if your district is getting new tier funding, what share of that new money is for English learners? The prior column was not funding. This column is actual funding that the district will receive. And in column 22, you will see the total allocation of funding for English learners. This will be the sum of the new tier funding for those students, as well as the amount for them in the base funding minimum.
Okay, so you know in general terms now how EL students receive funding through EBF, and you know how to locate the actual dollar amount your district receives for these students annually. Now let's discuss the statutory requirements for spending and reporting the use of these dollars. So the school districts are required to have a BPAC, need to have a TBE program. These are some of the requirements of BPAC, but not all. I just don't want to get into a BPAC right now because this isn't the presentation for it, but just a general overview of a BPAC for those who need a refresher. Now, in regards to EBF, the BPAC is required to review the annual EBF spending plan that is submitted to ISB. Any district, including those without a BPAC, must keep an accurate and detailed accounting on how EBF is being utilized. Furthermore, spending of EBF requires that 60% must be used for instructional costs. Also, it must be in addition to and not in lieu of other funding. Similar to, EBF cannot be used for supplanting, similar to Title III.
And then before we dive into the spending plan requirements, we want to address the reporting requirement for funds expended in service of students who are English learners. This is the only report associated with the EBF Spending Plan, or EBF generally, and is required of all organizational units that receive more than $5,000 in EBF funds. The EBF report is currently housed in Iowa's, and it's due mid-July each year. So districts receive funding. A year later, they have to account for the spending for these students. That's the only spending reporting requirement for EBF. And I'm going to tell you how to locate those expenditure reports. So we just talked through how to find the dollar amount that your district receives for these students. Shorthand way to do that I usually do is just Google EBF distribution ISB. That'll take you right to the distribution webpage, and then you will see a full calc file for all of the calculations for the full formula for that year. And then usually around September 1st, you will see the files for each of the 3 student populations that are called out in statute. So that's students who are low income, students with IEPs, and then English learners. So there's a separate file for each of those so you can see the dollar amount that's attributable for each of those groups. So you can get that dollar amount, let's say from FY22, you can see what your district received last year, and then you can go into this system, which I'm going to talk about, FRIS inquiry, and you can actually see what your district submitted as an expenditure report for those dollars that it was supposed to spend on behalf of those students. So this is the Financial Reimbursement Information System, known as FRIS. And you can see the expenditure reports that are submitted by each district here, and here's how. So if you just Google FRIS ISB, you'll find this, but the website is at the bottom of the deck. And then you want to click on Project, which you see up there at the top left. Once you are on the project page, you will not see this graph at the bottom initially. What you'll see is just those filters at the top. So you can select for the year, in this case we're selecting 2022. And then the entity is the organizational unit or district or whatever district or whatever group is receiving the funds. So you select the entity that you're interested in. And the program here is Bilingual Ed, TPI, and TBE. And then the sub-project code is not necessary, that'll populate. So this is the specific program that you need to look for if you want to see those dollar amounts. By the way, within FRIS, you can also see what the allotment was. So instead of going to the distribution page and downloading a spreadsheet, you can also just see what that allotment is right here. So once you've selected your district, you'll see a graph that says how much they received and expenditures if they were submitted at that point. And then if you look on the right there, you'll see the allotment. So how much did the district receive that year for this program? And then you will see the expenditure. And if you click where it says click here for detail, then you'll get a table with the expenditure report. So we'll look at that now. It's not great. It's not a lot of detail, but this is what it looks like. So as Edwin mentioned earlier, 60% of funds must be expended on instructional costs and services for these students. So here we're looking at a district that received and spent a little over $81,000 in FY22. And the bulk of that was in the Function 1000, which is for instruction, and then Object 100, which is salaries. So this district is receiving $81,000 in EBF for these students, and it's using that likely to fund a position. So the entirety of the investments here, the expenditures are for salaries and benefits. It'll vary a little bit depending on the district, but if we zoom out and kind of look at the behavior of all districts in the state, largely what we're seeing is, 95% of funds are within Function 1000, so districts meeting that statutory obligation for 60%. And then the majority of funds being spent on salaries and benefits, which if you think back to the cost factors, the additional investments for EL students, those are for staffing. So districts seem to be investing along the cost factors that are embedded in the formula. So this is what you'll see for the expenditure report for a district. And that's how you use FRIS inquiry to find that each year. Okay. So we're going to close out by discussing the spending plan requirement. We're going to highlight some upcoming changes to the spending plan. So in that survey that we showed at the start, about a third of you had participated in completing or collaborating on the EBF spending plan for your district. There are some changes that you all should be aware of about how that's going to be presented to districts and where it'll be located. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So beginning in the fall of 2021, ISB convened an advisory group to consider revisions to the EBF spending plan. This work was grounded in ISB's strategic plan, specifically Strategy 2.2.2, which focuses on educating advocates, stakeholders, and LEAs regarding equitably designating funds to support students. The aligned metric for 2022 was to convene an advisory group to establish a value proposition and guide the integration of the spending plan into another required plan, with a goal to support better alignment between resource allocation decisions and student needs. The advisory group consists of representatives from districts and advocacy organizations across the state. And the goal in building that advisory group was to facilitate a group composition that reflected the diversity of our state so that all students would be considered and represented. To that end, our members included both program and financial leaders within districts. They represent large and small districts that serve student populations reflective of Illinois families. And our advocacy stakeholders included groups that represent district professionals, regional interests, and the various student groups identified in EBF statute.
So our work was also grounded in the statutory requirements. The spending plan has three broad requirements. It must describe an organizational unit's plan for achieving student growth and making progress toward state education goals. It must document the intended use of state funds, and it must additionally provide a description of the intended use of resources attributable to students who are low income, English learners, or who receive special education services. The format and scope are developed by the state superintendent in ISB, and per statute, the plan is due annually by September 30th. Up to this point, the spending plan has lived in the Iowa system.
In our first meeting together with that advisory group, the group established three objectives. Specifically, the group aimed to identify a value proposition to guide the work, then identify whether and how to integrate the plan into another required report, and finally, to align the content of the plan with the value proposition. Noting that ISB has not made spending plan responses from districts or organizational units public up to this point, we considered whether the EBF spending plan could be redesigned to provide transparency regarding the intended use of state funds and support productive local dialogue about resource allocation for student groups.
Now, over the course of the first few meetings with this group, we established this value proposition that you see up here. So, driven from those four. So, highlight resource allocations for identified student groups, ELs, SPED, low income, by encouraging explicit connections between state and federal funding streams, and ISB required plans to lessen the planning burden on districts. Support districts in effective engagement of data-driven needs assessments and planning support for student groups most in need. Promote fiscal and academic alignment by encouraging conversations between programmatic, UL, and financial leaders within the district, which may include teacher leaders, parents, or other community stakeholders. Support analysis of the relationships between student outcomes and financial resources for organizational units and communities.
As we established this value proposition, other concepts emerged that we wanted to keep in mind as we continued our work. We refer to these as guiding principles. The guiding principles served as guardrails for the value proposition. They were intended as reminders for what we wanted to consider as we redesigned the spending plan. Ultimately, we were interested in productive local dialogue about resource allocation. To do that, we needed to ensure, obviously, compliance with statute, and we wanted to look for opportunities to reduce duplicative efforts or allow for equitable requirements for districts, and also to engage with transparency to show all stakeholders the proposed uses of EBF dollars. After considering several options, the advisory group determined that the EBF spending plan would best serve our goals if it were integrated into the annual district budget. Therefore, beginning in FY 2024, so we're currently still in the FY 23 EBF spending plan cycle. If you're responsible for that, if you could get it in before September 30th, I'd appreciate it. You won't see an email from me. But this change is going to be effective for FY 2024, so the next spending plan cycle. So the spending plan will be a tab within the budget form. And there are some organizational units, like regional offices of education, that receive EBF dollars but don't submit budgets to the state. Those organizational units will receive a form or be provided with a form to complete the spending plan requirement. Integration into the budget accomplishes several goals related to the elements of our value proposition. The consolidation of reporting requirements helps to lessen the planning burden on organizational units. So you used to have to do your budget and also have this Iowa spending plan in a separate place. Now you can consider those two things at the same time. The budget already has a public transparency requirement, and now the spending plan responses will be provided within the budget template. This integration allows for up to 2 opportunities for public discussion of how districts are investing state dollars. First, at the tentative budget hearing, if the district has completed the spending plan draft at that point, and again at the final budget hearing. Either way, districts are required to post on their websites their budgets, assuming they have websites. If not, they have to make it available in some other way. And so the spending plan is going to be embedded in that public-facing form. Finally, the budget is the plan for all funding streams. Organizational units can consider the intended use of EBF in the context of planned spending from all sources, so state, local, and federal, all can be considered at the same time. Now, the redesigned spending plan largely retains the structure of the current plan. The plan is going to be in a new place, but it will still be pretty familiar to the folks who have been completing it. As with the current plan, the redesigned spending plan has 3 parts. Part 1 is where organizational units indicate strategies for achieving student growth and making progress towards state education goals. Part 2 is where organizational units broadly indicate the intended use of EBF. And Part 3 is where they indicate planned investments for the student groups that are identified in statute. Consistent with the current spending plan, many items allow for the selection of responses from a provided list. Where there are narrative responses requested from a district, there are limits on how long those responses can be. We want this to be a pretty tight and focused document. We also want it to be legible to folks that don't have budget expertise. If you've opened a budget form before, it's pretty complicated, a lot of tabs, kind of hard to understand the structure of it. The spending plan piece we want to be fully understandable by the general public, in addition to the folks that are responsible for completing it. So while there is broad consistency with the current plan, the redesigned plan differs in 3 ways. First, the questions focus on prioritization. So rather than selecting many strategies for achieving student growth, for example, organizational units are asked to select the top 3 highest priority strategies. Additionally, the plan better integrates the language of cost factors as a framework for describing intended use. For example, districts are asked to indicate the top 3 priority cost factors that they will invest in using EBF. And finally, we are introducing for the first time a requirement to specify the intended use of new tier funding. So we will collect planned investments of new tier funds within the spending plan, and in this way we hope to provide valuable data for analysis of where organizational units are directing new state dollars.
Now, specific to English learner allocation, districts must provide assurance that at least 60% of the EBF funds attributable to students who are ELs are used for instructional costs of programs and services, and that the remainder of the funds are also used to support students who are ELs. Additionally, for districts that meet the requirement to have a BPAC, the BPAC must review the spending plan before it can be submitted. Now, the goal of these assurances is both accountability and transparency. We want to make sure that those who are advocating for our students who are ELs and who are closest to those students in the district get to partner with the district in making decisions for these students.
Okay, so if you will indulge us here, and we'll do a little post-check on whether we were successful in describing some of this stuff. So we're going to ask that you scan that QR code and answer those same questions. Give yourself, please, a little bit of grace, so that way the answers look a little better for us. You may not, in 5 minutes right now, be able to go find the expenditure report for your district or the actual dollar amount. Maybe you can. Maybe we did a great job. But you have the information at your fingertips now, and if you practice just once or twice, you'll meet that benchmark. So take a few minutes, go ahead and answer those questions.
You could enter the voting code at the bottom.
Oh, if you go to so somebody's saying that QR code is not. Yeah, so yeah. Raise your hand if you think that you could answer some of those questions a little better than you could at the start. All right, great. Yeah, we'll accept that. Okay, so we are happy to answer any questions that you have. I'll come down there and work the room. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you. I also wanted to say quickly, you have our emails up here, so if you think of something later and you want to ask us a question, you can always contact us. We're happy to answer. I'll come to you.
I was just curious with the changes for FY24. Is that going to affect the timeline at all? So, like right now, the September, usually September 1st, the funding amounts are out. By September 30th, we're submitting things. So, just to kind of get an idea in my brain. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. So it does not change the timeline for when the disbursements are known. So generally, early August, you know the full distribution amount for your district plus tier funding. And then a month later, September 1st, you know the dollar amounts for each of the 3 student groups. So that's not going to change. What is changing is the statutory requirement to submit the spending plan by September 30th. We are changing the statutory language there to better align with the timeline for when districts transmit their adopted budgets to the state. So budgets must be adopted by the end of the first quarter or September 30th, I believe. And then typically there's another 30 days to get it to the state after adoption. So depending on when you adopt it, you have another 30 days to submit it to the state. So we're changing, just making a slight modification to the language in statute about the spending plan to better align the due date for the spending plan with the budget. And it'll just be intuitive. It's in the budget form. So when you submit it, that will need to be complete. Does that answer your question? Great. Others?
So am I correct to understand, obviously not this year, next year, when we go to fill out the ISBE district budget form, is there going to be a tab at the bottom of that form that also has the EBF spending plan? Is that what that's going to look like moving forward?
Yeah, so the question is, next year, plan is not going to be an IWAS. Will we see it as a tab within the budget form? Yes, that's where you will find it. And as I mentioned, many of the questions are still sort of select from lists, you know, so the responses are right there. There's a couple narrative sections. There will be a new table for how districts are indicating their investments for tier funding. And it'll use the 34 cost factors as a framework for that, but there's also an app. EBF is an unrestricted fund. You're not required to invest it in any particular way, except when it comes to the requirement around spending for EL students. So there's always an option for districts to articulate a different way that they're using those dollars. So there's flexibility still within that spending plan. Yeah, so the question is, can a district use EL/EBF solely on salaries and benefits? Absolutely, they can. The requirement is 60% of what a district receives has to be spent on instructional costs and services. So teacher salaries fit that, right? So do supplies. But I think a benefit of having a public-facing spending plan document now is you can see how your local districts are responding to that. And you can also look at expenditure reports. And so you'll have that information on sort of what has been the pattern over time. And then there can be local conversations about whether there needs to be changes to that as well. Question is, are carryover funds calculated into current year EBF funds? And can you specify what you mean by carryover? Great question, yes. So yes and no is the answer to that. When you go and you look at the distribution calculations, you're not going to see carryovers within that. That's just going to be current year fiscal allotment. The reason I wanted to show you FRIS inquiry is that's where you can find carryover to some extent. You can see an allotment for a given year, and then you can see an expenditure. And in that way, you could determine if there's a carryover amount or not. Yeah. Now, it may be the case that when you look for the next year at allotment, that it would include that. That is, districts submit the expenditure report in IWAS, and any unexpended amounts are carried over. So a district sees that it has, let's say it got 100,000 the next year as well, but it still had 30,000 unexpended. It would see 130,000 that it had to report for. So that the carryover does work there, but you can see it within FRIS inquiry. I'm going to try to bring this mic to you.
My question is related to the salaries. So my understanding was that if I were to pay a salary from this, it had to be a new position. Like, I couldn't say, oh, we're going to pick up the 3rd grade dual language teacher. We've had that position for a long time. So my understanding was, nope, that's not what the purpose is for those funds.
Edwin, do you know, how do you respond to that?
I will have to ask to make sure that's the right answer, but feel free to shoot me an email and I can find out for you for sure.
So the language is in addition to, not in lieu of, right? So it's not just, but it has to be on instructional costs for those particular students, but not positive about the answer. So if you shoot us an email, we can get you a firm answer. Come to you.
So I'm curious about, you were indicating that actually the public can access to look at the EBF funding and the spending plan, right? And I guess what I'm asking about, and not that I want to call out any districts, but we heard from Joanne that some of the districts that are going to get monitored, one of the red flags is districts that haven't been spending their EBF funding for EL monies. So I guess my question is, if I go into FRIS, would I be able, and I decided to do an exhaustive look at 850 school districts, could I eventually find districts that haven't spent all their EBF funding for ELs?
Yes, it would take you some time. There may be ways, I'm still learning the system myself. There may be ways to bulk download data. I'm not positive about that. But for any particular fiscal year, for any particular district, you can see what did they get in allotments, what did they spend. And if there's a gap there, then you would know that that's a gap. But you might have to sort of backtrack a few years to kind of see a pattern as well.
Yeah, and then for our monitoring, that is a risk factor. It isn't the only risk factor, but that is embedded into our algorithm for selection criteria for a district. But we have seen it internally does have a significant weight. Some districts before who were, let's say, ranked 40, now we added the EOEBF, they have a lot of carryover, let's say over 200%. Now they're shooting all the way at the top because that's a red flag to us. They're not utilizing those state funds that they should be.
There's some nuance to that as well. There may be legitimate reasons why you don't fully expend in a given year. And that could be especially true on the lower end of the spectrum where you don't receive that much. You might want to let it accrue and compound over years because the way the formula works is you always get your, assuming sufficient appropriations, I'm always asked to give that caveat, but you always get your prior year funding and then new tier funding, and it'll build each year. So if you don't have enough in a particular fiscal year to fund a new position, but it's your goal to fill a position, let's say you get like 30,000, you can't fund a position with that. But the following year, if there's the additional tier funding, then you might have enough now as a stable funding source to make that investment in that position. So there can be reasons that in a given fiscal year, not 100% of funds are expended. I wasn't at Joanne's presentation, so I'm not sure on the particulars as it relates to monitoring.
So to know that how much a district is getting, is it the allotment, like in that FRIS website, is it the allotment and then the disbursement amount? You compare those two?
Allotment and expenditure. And keep in mind that for FY23, you might see an allotment, but the expenditure reports are not due until July of 2024. So you're not going to see that this year. Those expenditure reports are due annually. But for FY22, you would see an allotment for FY22 in that particular program for that district. And then if they have submitted their expenditure report at this point, you would see that. And that's what you can compare to see. But I also think when there are questions about that too, the best place to inquire is with your local district. We don't necessarily see the detail in terms of what's driving a particular discrepancy. And it could in fact be an error. If a district hadn't submitted in one particular year and then it rolled over to the next year, those funds could have been expended, they just missed the reporting requirement. They still need to do it at some point. But then those dollars are not actually unexpended, they were expended. It was just they didn't do the expenditure report. So I think as it comes to particular questions about, what's going on in a particular district, that's a local question. You talk to folks in the business office. Yes.
So if a district has a large increase in ELs, will that increase our EBF as well? And how long will that take?
Yeah, that's also a yes and a no question. Your enrollment is driving the adequacy target for your district. Small changes in enrollment are not likely to have major changes on the adequacy target. And then remember, what drives funding is actually the percentage of adequacy for the district. So it's the local resources divided by the adequacy target. And that percentage is what's going to drive any new tier funding. So if you were a tier 2 district, for example, and you saw a major increase in EL students, and that shifted your percentage of adequacy enough to get you into tier 1, yeah, you would see a difference in funding. In other cases, it won't be immediate. And how things shake out kind of depends on what the picture is across the state. There are a lot of districts that were moved into tier 1 this year because CPS moved from tier 1 to tier 2. So that freed up capacity in tier 1, and so we saw more districts getting that. So kind of how things are playing out with state funding across the entire state also has an impact here.
And has the work of the task force been completed at this point? Well, the EBF advisory group looking at, obviously there's,
Yeah, so in terms of the current state, I think there were 8 or 9 meetings since last fall. And we have a draft plan in place. We are initiating internal review across the agency. We've shared it with the PRP at this point. And now we're just sort of getting the word out to folks about its placement in the budget going forward. So this is a group we're presenting to. We will be at some regional conferences for IASBO, a conference for special education administrators, so just starting to get the word out. There are regional conferences that happen, so I'll present at a couple of those. And then, like I said, a special education administrators conference next month that I'll be presenting at. And it's really at this level, right? What we want to do right now is make sure folks are aware. It's not going to be in IWAS. It's going to be in the budget. And the responses will be public facing, so you'll be able to see them going forward. So we think there's value there. Eventually, we will have a draft plan that we can publish, and ideally we'll be able to publish that in advance of it actually being in the budget so folks can start to get familiar with the kinds of questions and so on. But again, there will not be major changes to the content of the spending plan. It's going to be pretty similar. The key difference, I think, is prioritization. So what are your priorities with these limited dollars in the first place? And then what are you doing with your new tier funding in particular? And when it comes to understanding the impact of EBF over time, the professional review panel has to produce a report that is a 5-year analysis of EBF. And the first 5 years have passed, and there's a report that's published, and you should be able to find it online. When it comes to the next 5 years, we will actually know where all those new tier dollars have gone. So that's a question that we couldn't answer for the first 5 years, but through the EBF spending plan responses, we will be able to 5 years from now. What time are we at? Okay.
Any more questions? No? All right, well, thank you everyone for sticking along. I know not the most fun, but we appreciate your attention and joining us.
Thank you.
Yep.